arrogant millionaire mocked his assistant's looks until he saw her at the pool and lost it. Some people are born to be noticed, others learn how to disappear. Leah Morgan knew exactly which category she belonged to. It was Monday morning, 7:58 in the morning, when she stepped through the glass doors of Silverline Studios, one of the largest television production houses in downtown Los Angeles. In the marble-floored lobby, publicists in heels glided by like wind, producers yelled into phones, and young assistants clutched laptops as they raced between elevator doors. Leah stood to the side, avoiding collisions. In her arms, she carried a stack of printed schedules, production memos, and a canvas tote bag filled with essentials no one else ever remembered but her. At 28, Leah Morgan had mastered the art of professional invisibility. Her curly hair was pulled into a neat low bun, a crisp white blouse, black pencil skirt, and practical flats. Her makeup was minimal, just enough to avoid the dreaded "Are you feeling okay?" comments. For the past 2 years, Leah had worked under Julian Reed, the creative director and executive producer of the network's most successful drama series. She had never arrived late, never missed a deadline, never received praise. Julian was the epitome of Hollywood power, handsome, sharp, exacting, and notoriously unsentimental. He was the kind of man who walked into a room and silenced it without raising his voice. Leah never expected him to notice her. She only hoped he'd let her do her job. She was the one who knew he liked his coffee black, no sugar, loathed morning meetings, and had a strange vendetta against any font that wasn't Helvetica. She was the invisible engine that kept the creative chaos from derailing, quiet, efficient, and never demanding recognition. Julian's office was on the 3rd floor, reserved for the inner circle. And Leah, despite being closest to him in schedule and tasks, was still treated like a shadow in that space. This morning was no different. When she placed the coffee on his desk and double-checked the day's schedule, Julian entered without glancing at her. "Reorder the scene structure for episode 9, he said, eyes still on his phone. "The transitions aren't working." "Already done," Leah replied, calm and soft-spoken. "I figured you'd want the changes after yesterday's rough cut." Julian nodded but didn't look up. She stepped back, retreating into the familiar silence that stretched between clipped commands and long stretches of being unnoticed. She didn't expect thanks. She only hoped not to be dismissed. But today, a single careless comment, cold, offhand, and unintentional, would shatter Leah Morgan's quiet world. And everything would begin to change. The Monday morning production meeting unfolded as usual, tense, long, and void of patience. Leah sat quietly at the end of the editing room table, tablet in hand, swiftly noting every change Julian demanded for the upcoming episode. Julian paced in front of the projection screen, sharp-eyed and sharper-tongued. He directed cuts, rewrites, lighting changes. Nothing short of perfection would do for him. Leah was used to it. The intensity, the lack of acknowledgement, the constant interruptions, the way she was treated like background software, essential, but never really seen. After the meeting, as people began gathering their notes, a new production assistant, Lisa, smiled and said, "You're lucky to have Leah. I don't know how she keeps all this straight." Julian gave that signature half-smile of his, not quite mocking, not exactly kind, and then he said, just loud enough for only Leah and Lisa to hear, "Helps when your assistant isn't a visual distraction." Lisa chuckled, not catching the full meaning. But Leah did. She heard it clearly, so clearly it sliced through her like glass. She stood frozen for a second. No one around her noticed. Julian had already turned and walked out, continuing his day as if she didn't exist. Back at her desk, Leah kept her expression calm, composed. But inside, something shattered. It wasn't the first time her appearance had been overlooked, but this time it came from someone who had worked beside her for 2 years, someone she thought, at the very least, respected her dedication, even if he never showed it. It wasn't the words themselves. It was the truth behind his tone, that she wasn't attractive enough to be considered a distraction, that she was so invisible she didn't even warrant aesthetic judgment. At lunch, she sat in the break room, phone in hand. She texted her best friend Maya. "He said something today. I don't know if it hurt because it was offensive or because it made me realize I've never truly been seen." Maya's reply came within seconds. "You deserve better." Leah stared at her phone, then slowly set it down. She sat there, unmoving, eyes on the untouched cup of coffee growing cold in her hands. She had gotten used to being invisible, but for the first time in a long while, she started to wonder, why should I have to? That night, Leah returned to her small Westwood apartment later than usual. She didn't turn on the lights right away. Standing in the dim silence, she set her bag down, kicked off her shoes, and let the quiet settle over her like a heavy blanket. Julian's words still echoed in her mind, bouncing like sound in an empty room. "When your assistant isn't a visual distraction." Leah had never seen herself as someone who needed to be noticed, but that didn't mean she deserved to be ignored. She had always believed that dedication would be recognized, that professionalism was enough to earn respect. But now she realized effort doesn't always equal value. She sank into the couch, opened her laptop. Unread emails, unfinished edits, unconfirmed meetings. But instead of diving into work, she opened the company's internal job board. The posting was bold at the top of the screen. Position: Internal Communications Lead, Silverline Studios. A role perfectly suited to her skills: message management, strategic writing, creative coordination, and most importantly, a role that wasn't assistant. She hesitated. Was this just a reaction to a hurtful comment? Or had she been suppressing this decision for far too long? The next morning, she arrived at the studio early as always. But something had changed. She no longer rushed to Julian's desk with his usual steaming coffee. She placed the cup down silently and returned to her seat without waiting for acknowledgement. No smile, no good morning, no polite concern about how he'd slept. She didn't even glance to see whether his eyes passed over her like she was office decor. She no longer cared to be seen. That afternoon, during her lunch break, Leah submitted her application. She composed an email to Vivian Carter, head of HR, with a closing line that said everything. "I believe it's time I stepped into a role that reflects the true value of what I bring." She clicked send. Then sat back in her chair, heart racing. It wasn't fear. Not exactly. It was something closer to freedom. Leah Morgan was done waiting to be noticed. For the first time in 2 years, she gave herself permission to step out from someone else's shadow. Julian noticed something was off. Not all at once. It was the way a clock ticks half a second out of sync, subtle enough to ignore, but just loud enough to unsettle. Leah wasn't hovering the way she used to. She no longer appeared with his coffee before he even asked. She still handled everything: schedules, scripts, emails, but without the usual courteous warmth. Her responses were still accurate, still efficient, but colder, distant. And what unsettled Julian the most was that he didn't know why. Every time he passed her desk, it felt like walking through thicker air. Not hostility, but the absence of familiarity. Leah, who had always been like background music, subtle but constant, now carried a silence that felt sharp. She no longer left handwritten notes with little reminders. Didn't ask if he needed anything after meetings. Didn't nod politely when he entered a room. For the first time in 2 years, Julian found her unfamiliar. He asked himself if something had happened, then dismissed the thought. She was still working. No complaints, no absences, no mistakes. So why did it feel like something vital had shifted, something he didn't even know he relied on? Julian Reed wasn't a man known for noticing emotional nuances, But this time he couldn't ignore it. Leah Morgan had changed, and it was throwing him off balance in a way he couldn't yet understand. And sometimes, silence creates the loudest wake-up call of all. The company had planned a weekend retreat in Santa Barbara, a yearly event meant to reinvigorate creative synergy. Leah was never fond of these things, but with her application for the new position submitted, she knew it was wise to attend. When Julian arrived at the resort that Friday afternoon, dressed in his usual dark suit, he was immediately pulled into a whirlwind of greetings, planning sessions, and pitches from upper-level producers. He didn't notice Leah at first, not because she wasn't there, but because she looked different. She was standing near the pool, deep in conversation with Marcus, the head of content, and the man who'd likely be her future boss if she moved departments. She wore a light blue jumpsuit, her hair loose in the breeze, and she was laughing, really laughing, wide, free, none of the guarded professionalism he'd grown used to. Julian froze. Was that Leah? She had always been reserved, careful, almost a fixture in the office background. But this woman, this bright, confident presence, eyes sparkling in the afternoon sun, was not the Leah he thought he knew. And what unsettled him most was this. He noticed her. In a way, he'd never let himself notice her before. All evening, he found himself watching her without meaning to. Leah flowed between conversations with ease, like she belonged there. No one treated her like Julian's assistant. They looked at her like a woman, independent, sharp, articulate, compelling. Julian wasn't used to feeling this way, especially when Marcus threw his head back laughing at something Leah had said. She touched his arm lightly, a fleeting, casual gesture, and Julian felt his chest tighten. Jealousy, a foreign emotion, and entirely irrational. Leah wasn't his. She was his assistant, his employee, his... No, not anymore. In that moment, Julian realized she had stepped out of the orbit he controlled, and he wasn't sure he could pull her back in. He asked himself, had he ever truly seen her? Not as an extension of his calendar or inbox, but as a whole person with her own gravity? The answer stung more than he expected. That night, Julian returned to his room earlier than usual. No after-hours drinks, no small talk with colleagues. He withdrew from the crowd under the excuse of unfinished work, but truthfully, he just couldn't sit with what was growing in his chest. Emptiness. Not the usual kind, but a hollow ache, the absence of something unnamed, yet ever present. Leah, not Leah the assistant, but Leah, the person behind the spreadsheets, the reminders, the quiet reliability. Now she wasn't part of his orbit anymore, no longer revolving around his schedule, no longer asking questions that made him feel like the axis of the universe. He thought of her expression when she laughed with Marcus, open, relaxed, radiant. She had never looked at him like that. Or maybe she had, and he'd been too blind to see it. For the first time, Julian felt he had lost something he didn't even know he possessed. A piece of his world, one he thought was fixed, had quietly stepped away. No dramatic exit, no confrontation, just gone. And in its absence, he felt something close to fear. 2 days after the retreat, the air in the office felt heavier. Leah worked as she always had, but Julian found himself hyper-aware of her every movement, every silence, every word unsaid. That evening, after most people had left, Leah stepped into his office, knocking politely but with certainty. "Do you have a minute?" Julian nodded, though his pulse quickened. "What's going on?" Leah stood tall, her gaze steady. "I wanted to officially let you know. I've applied for the internal communications lead position. I passed the first round. My final interview is this Friday." She wasn't asking, she was informing him, and that distinction chilled him more than he expected. "You didn't think to tell me earlier?" he asked, his voice lower than usual. Leah raised an eyebrow. "Did I need your permission?" Julian rose from his chair. No, of course not. I just thought, after everything we've worked on. You thought I'd always be here, she cut in, calm but firm. You got used to me always showing up, always anticipating, always orbiting around you. Julian said nothing, because she was right. You know what? Leah continued, stepping closer. I used to think that being excellent would be enough to earn respect. But after 2 years, all I've received is a comment about how I'm not attractive enough to be distracting, from the man I once respected. Julian's face tensed. That's not what I meant. But it's what you said, and it's what you believed. Silence stretched between them. No excuses. Nowhere to hide. Leah? Julian exhaled, the word more confession than call. I don't know what happened to me after that retreat, but I can't stop thinking about you. Seeing you there, so alive, so confident, I realized I don't want you to leave. Leave the job, Leah asked, or leave you? Julian swallowed hard. Both. Leah let out a breath of something like a laugh, but there was no humor in it. Here's the thing, Julian. I don't belong to you. I never did. You only thought I did because I made your life easier. That's not true, he said, stepping closer. I love you, Leah. I didn't realize it sooner, but No, she cut in, her voice now trembling slightly. Not now, not when I'm finally starting to remember who I am. Not because you suddenly feel something after watching me talk to someone else. Julian froze. She had seen. Leah inhaled slowly. I'm not saying I don't feel anything. I did. I loved you deeply. But I won't trade my dignity and my future for a confession that comes too late. What do I do? Julian asked quietly, almost broken. What do I have to become to deserve you? Leah looked at him for a long time. I don't want you to become someone else. I want you to see me, not as a convenience, not as a fixture in your world, as a person. And if you really love me, then let me go. If it's real, it won't disappear. She turned to leave. My interview's on Friday. I trust you won't interfere. Julian didn't speak. He only nodded, a small, heavy gesture. And in that moment, he finally understood. Love isn't about keeping someone close. It's about not standing in their way when they need to fly. Julian sat alone in his office after Leah left. The door had closed with a soft click, but to him it echoed like the final slam of a chapter ending. There had been no shouting, no tears, and yet it was the clearest goodbye he had ever experienced. He didn't feel angry. He just felt empty. For the first time in a very long while, Julian realized he had no control. Not over the work, not over Leah, not even over himself. He looked around the office, the space that had always been his domain, where everything had its place and everyone followed his lead. But tonight it was just walls, cold wood, soft sterile lighting, and a coffee cup, still full, untouched. Leah used to know exactly how he took his coffee and exactly when he needed it. Now no one knew. Julian braced both hands on the desk, lowered his head, and exhaled, trying to keep the unraveling inside from showing on the outside. He'd thought that saying, "I love you," would be enough to fix it. He'd thought love was a reason, a remedy, a happily ever after. But Leah had been right. Love doesn't arrive to rescue. It arrives to confront. He hadn't loved her the way she deserved to be loved. He loved her for how she made him feel, safe, capable, essential. But he hadn't truly seen her, hadn't loved her as her own person, with fire, flaws, fears, and dreams. And now he was paying the price for that, through the quietest kind of loss. He didn't know if a second chance would come. But for the first time, Julian understood. If there was even a sliver of hope, he'd have to change. Genuinely, fully. From the inside. Not for Leah, but for himself. Leah didn't come into the office that Friday morning. She had her interview. Julian knew that. But what he didn't expect was how painfully empty everything would feel in her absence. The office moved on, meetings, emails, calls. But to Julian, it all felt hollow, like the rhythm still played, but the melody was gone. When he passed her empty desk, he paused. A neatly stacked folder sat in the center. A pen was perfectly aligned at its edge. Everything in its place, except her. There were no more handwritten notes in purple ink. No faint scent of the coffee Leah always drank. No quiet, perceptive woman who somehow always knew what he needed before he asked. No more Leah. It didn't feel like losing a great assistant. It felt like losing a part of himself, one he hadn't understood until it was gone. That evening, Julian didn't go straight home. He walked for hours through the long, sprawling streets of Los Angeles, away from the office, away from everything familiar. Eventually, he found himself at the one place that had always brought him peace, his mother's home. She opened the door before he even knocked. She didn't ask questions. She simply welcomed him in, poured him a warm cup of tea, and sat down across from him. "I thought I'd be fine," Julian began, voice rough. "It's just one person leaving, just an assistant, but it's not just that." His mother looked at him for a long moment, then nodded gently. "It's not about her leaving. It's about realizing you never really had her to begin with." Julian clenched his hands. "I hurt her. Not intentionally. I was just careless, too used to people staying because I made things work." "And now that she's not there," his mother said softly, "you finally see how much her presence meant." He nodded. "I love her, Mom," Julian said, the words coming out for the first time, not just to someone else, but to himself. "If you truly love, prove it not with power, but with your heart." His mother replied. Julian looked up at her, his usually sharp eyes softening, touched by something almost vulnerable. He didn't know if Leah would ever come back, but for the first time in his life, Julian understood. He couldn't stay the man he had been, if he wanted to keep something real. In the days that followed, Julian didn't rush to find Leah. He showed up to work on time, held meetings, signed contracts, but everything felt like it was happening behind glass, distant, muffled. At times, he found himself staring at her empty desk, not knowing how long he'd been looking. No one mentioned Leah, no one asked, but everyone sensed something had shifted. Julian didn't act impulsively. No flowers, no desperate texts, no dramatic calls. He knew this time words wouldn't be enough. She had left his world with the calm strength of a woman who had grown through pain, and he couldn't use old tools to reach someone who had already moved beyond them. On a quiet Saturday afternoon, with sunlight spilling gold across the city, Julian sat in his apartment holding a printed sheet of paper, the internal copy of Leah's job application he'd seen on the company server. Not to track her, but to understand her better, to read each word she'd written, each sentence she'd carefully crafted, not as a manager scanning a resume, but as someone finally listening to her voice. Not through schedules or scripts, but through her own dreams and quiet ambitions. He hadn't seen it before, but now he did. And for the first time, Julian didn't want to keep her. He only wished for a chance to step into the world she had begun to build, on her own terms, with her own light and her own bravery. He stood, reached for his coat. No script, no excuses, just a heart, fully open, and hope. Leah's last day in her old apartment passed more quietly than she expected. No farewell party, no flowers, no loud goodbyes. But she didn't need that. She'd had enough noise over the past 2 years. Now all she wanted was a quiet exit. Late in the afternoon, as she packed up the last of her things, an email popped up from Julian. "Come to my office, just a few minutes. J.R." She paused, then nodded, not out of curiosity, but because she knew some endings deserved to be done right. Julian was standing by the window when she entered. No sharp suit, no tie. Just a man, hands in his pockets, turning slowly at the sound of the door. "Thanks for coming," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Leah gave a small nod. "I assume you have something to say." He nodded too. "Yeah, not as your boss, not to convince you to stay, just as someone who needs to say this, for you to know." He stepped closer, not too close, just enough to stand in the open. "Leah, I was wrong. I've been wrong for a long time. I undervalued your presence, treated you like a function, not a person. I said things that hurt you because I didn't have the courage to really see you." Leah didn't reply, but her throat tightened. "I used to think I loved my job more than anything, but when you submitted your transfer, I realized the work means nothing if I can't share it with someone who matters. And that person is you." Silence wrapped around them. Julian took another step forward. His eyes weren't cold anymore, only honest, fully, finally. "I love you, Leah, not because you made my life easier, but because the moment you walked out of my world, it became painfully hollow." She inhaled slowly. "I can't come back as your assistant." "I don't want you to," he said, a soft smile forming. "I don't want you to go back. I just hope you'll give me a chance, not to fix what I broke, but to start something real." Leah held his gaze, then slowly nodded. "I'm not saying no to a chance," she said, "but I'm not giving up my path either. I fought too hard to take this step forward, and I won't trade it, not even for love." Julian nodded, serious. "I don't want you to trade anything." "Then if you're serious," Leah said, her eyes steady, "show me, not with words, with action. Love me not through regret, but through growth." She turned and walked out, for the last time, no longer an assistant, no longer someone's shadow. Julian didn't stop her. He just watched, because finally he understood. Hope wasn't about holding on. It was about becoming someone she'd choose to walk beside. After that afternoon, Julian didn't text, didn't call, didn't send flowers or excuses to see her again. He stayed silent, but not absent. He honored Leah's words, show it in actions, and the first action was space. For the first 6 weeks after Leah transferred departments, no one saw Julian set foot on the communications floor. No forwarded emails, no subtle check-ins. But sometimes, when Leah sent out reports, his name quietly remained in the CC field, like a silent reminder. "I'm watching, but I won't interfere." Leah threw herself into her new role like she was rediscovering herself. No longer confined to schedules and endless requests, she finally had a voice. Her ideas were heard. The things she once swallowed in silence now had room to speak. Still, on quiet nights, as the city lights flickered on, Leah sometimes remembered that afternoon. Julian's voice, no longer a CEO's tone, but a man learning to love by letting go. And it was that letting go that made her believe maybe, this time, the love was real. No pressure, no claim, no rush. Only, if there's still something there, give me a chance. I'll wait. She hadn't answered, but she thought about it more than she wanted to admit. 6 months passed, and fate, in its quiet timing, had a way of placing two people back in the same frame. But this time, under a different kind of light. 6 months might not seem long in the span of a lifetime, but sometimes it's just enough for two people to change. Truly. Leah was now head of internal communications, a role she once believed she could never reach if she stayed in someone else's shadow. But here she was, sitting in executive meetings, presenting strategies, defending her ideas. And most importantly, being heard. She was no longer Julian's assistant trailing behind. She was Leah, confident, sharp, resilient. And everyone saw it. Julian was still the CEO, but not the same man. Gone was the arrogant, all-controlling leader. These 6 months had softened something in him. He hadn't disappeared, he'd simply stepped back to grow. They saw each other again at company-wide meetings, internal events, or sometimes just in passing. Julian always greeted her with calm eyes, a quiet smile, and Leah slowly stopped bracing herself. Bit by bit they rebuilt, not with promises, but with trust. Until one golden autumn afternoon, when the city turned soft and amber, Julian asked to meet, not as colleagues, but just Julian and Leah. They sat on the rooftop of a small cafe, looking over a skyline that had witnessed both of their transformations. "I used to think love was a kind of control," Julian began, voice steady. "That if you were smart enough, strong enough, you could manage feelings, yours and everyone else's." Leah tilted her head, but said nothing. "But you taught me the opposite," he continued. "That real love is the courage to let go, not to lose someone, but to let them be fully themselves." He exhaled, looked at her. No hesitation now. "I love you. In a way that even if you don't come back, I'll still be grateful for having loved you. Once, truly." Leah pressed her lips together, her throat tightening. But it was a soft ache now, not pain. Julian stood and gently pulled a small box from his coat. He didn't kneel, no theatrics, just quietly opened it. Inside was a silver ring, no diamond, no glamour. Simple, thoughtful, like the way he now loved. "I won't promise I won't mess up," Julian said, "but I will promise this. I will see you, every day, as you are, and I will never forget who you are." He drew in a breath. "Thank you for showing me what it means to truly see someone." A quiet pause. Then Leah reached out, her hand resting lightly on the box. "I'm not saying yes," she said, her eyes bright, "until you're ready to be in something where no one leads, no one follows." Julian nodded. "Then let's walk side by side." Leah smiled. This time, their steps would never fall out of rhythm again. Love doesn't always begin with a first glance. Sometimes it begins the moment you finally dare to truly see someone. Julian once believed power was the only way to make someone stay. But Leah taught him, real love is letting go. It's waiting without pressure. It's changing, not to win someone back, but to become someone better, for yourself and the one you love. Leah, too, learned to love again, not with a naive heart, but with the strength of a woman who now knew her worth. There was no fairy tale ending, no swelling music, no grand fireworks. Just two people who once hurt each other, now slowly learning to love again, with trust, with kindness, and as equals. And sometimes that's the most beautiful kind of happy ending there is.